This is Event Horizon, and I am your host, Mark Anthony Peterson. This is the show where I take a walk into the conspiracy with a splash of the paranormal. This is the show that would be born if David Icke and the X-Files had a baby. This is also the podcast that has become show notes for late night paranormal talk show hosts. So get your pens and pads ready. We're jumping back in early. Last week, I gave you a show entitled The Time Before Time. Dimensional dream skipping, consciousness, and time slippage. I wanted to jump back on and give you a few more of my thoughts on consciousness and dreaming. I wanted to tighten up that connection so that you understand why I call consciousness God and why dreaming is so important to connecting with God. In the last episode, I told you that consciousness is the summation of what is, what was, and what will be. That's God. I also want you to understand that we experience consciousness through our DNA. Yes, our DNA is the summation of all the lives that it took to build the current day and the reflection of the lives that will come in the future. That DNA not only maintains the tether that links us to our future generations, it maintains the tether that links us to our future actions, the tendencies of who we are. How many of you saw the cartoon, The Last Airbender? In that show, The Last Airbender was able to get into a meditative state and speak to the past lives that represented him. The summation of who he was across all generations, and gain advice from each one of those past lives. That DNA tether is not just linked to the past, but also to the future. Genesis 4:10 and 11 picks up at the moment where Cain kills Abel. And God speaks to Cain and says to him, "Your brother's bloods, plural, are crying out to me from the ground." This biblical passage is a clear indication that our DNA not only links us to our past, but is a link to the future, to the lives that will follow us, to the actions that will drive us, that consciousness that is around us. And that's why we can sense it. And that's why dreams are so important. Dreams are the connection to the consciousness. Now, I recently heard a talk show host call dreams unconscious and our waking hours conscious. That's backwards. Dreams are our connection to God, our connection to the consciousness that was there before time. And when we wake back to unconsciousness. You see, dreams connect us back to the network. It allows us to realize past, present, and future all at once. We are not bound by mass. We are not bound by energy. We are truly conscious at the moment when we are disconnected from the body and where the mind only exists. That is the true nature of consciousness. When we are dreaming, we are connected. When we are awake, we are no more than a standalone computer. So in the beginning, we were a centralized swarm network. That's what I talk about in previous episodes. But today, we are a distributed, decentralized computer system. And our evolutionary track proves it. Park that thought. I'm going to come back to that in just a few minutes when I tell you how closely linked our brains are to this activity, to this ability to participate in consciousness and to make matter out of nothing. But before we go into that, I want to go back and retrace my steps on the three parts that I said we were made of. Consciousness, which is a slice of the divine, the soul, and the spirit. Now, we just finished talking about consciousness, summation of what was, what is, and what will be, that is manifested physically through our DNA. Our soul is our celestial identity, as I explained in last episode. The elements on the periodic table all have a purpose. As do the elements, so do our souls. We are born with a purpose. And therefore, each soul is unique and has a unique purpose on this plane. That's why it is our celestial identity. What is that made up of? Well, I'm going to get a little crazy on you. It's first made up of your universal sign, your zodiac, the sign that describes how well you will use consciousness to heal, fight, persuade, basically to make the world a better place. How will you take that consciousness that's in you and manifest it through empathy in the world? Your life path number. Your life path number is who you are at birth and the native traits that you will carry with you throughout life, those tendencies. And those tendencies become reinforced with each successive generation. Yeah, your DNA. And then the final piece is your reincarnation mark. What do I mean by that? Many of you have seen people who have had birthmarks. Gorbachev from the 90s had a major birthmark across his forehead. And in my reincarnation episode, episode 3, I think, I talk about people who had reincarnation marks that showed the type of death that they had. If they had a bullet wound, they would have a mark where the bullet pierced their body. If they were stabbed, the same type of mark would be made on the reincarnated body, indicated how they died. That's the third part of what makes up the soul, because it is the reflection of the sin of past lives that must be carried forward and atoned for before that soul can ascend. And the last part, the spirit. The spirit, as I mentioned, is the spark of light that binds the soul and the consciousness into this plane. The spark activates the DNA. It activates the magnetic field in your brain, and it connects the tether, that string, to the future. Now, you think I'm making this up. According to scientificalert.com, at the moment of conception, scientists have confirmed that a spark of light is generated when the sperm meets the egg. That spark is the electrical charge that activates the system, that gives the brain that magnetic field. And why is that so important? Why is it important that the brain have this magnetic field? As I mentioned in a previous episode, scientists have confirmed that magnetic fields can give electrons that have no mass, that you can essentially create mass from nothing if you have an electromagnetic field. Well, the brain produces a weak electrical current through the migration of ions, and this generates a magnetic field in the brain. The brain also contains magnetic particles deep within the organ tissue. German scientists in 2008 confirmed that some parts of the brain have more magnetic particles than other parts of the brain. And this is what's going to really bake your noodle. The brain stem and the cerebellum contain the most magnetic material. The brain stem and the cerebellum evolved first within our system before we got a cerebral cortex. The cerebellum receives information from all of our sensory systems, the spinal cord, and other parts of the brain that regulate our movement. The brain stem controls messages to and from our brain and controls consciousness and determines whether or not we are awake or asleep. Guys, if these were the first two parts of our brain system, this is how we walked with God. We had a direct connection to creating matter and being anywhere in the consciousness or the universe we wanted to be. The magnetic fields in the cerebellum and the stem gave us the ability to sense reality in a way that we can't now. We didn't have to move the mountain. We became the mountain. When we developed the cerebral cortex became the harness that limited our ability to connect to the network. Yeah, the cerebral cortex is the physical evidence that God kicked us off his network. Because the cerebral cortex also controls our sensory glands and gives us the responsibility for decision making, problem solving, judgment, and memory. Right, memory. Before the cerebral cortex, everything that was in the consciousness, and we stored everything we were in the cloud or in the consciousness that existed around us. The cerebral cortex gave us the ability to be independent, decentralized computers. And the only thing connecting us back to that network are our dreams. The next point I wanted to make. Awareness and consciousness, to me, are two separate things. Consciousness does not need to be aware. God does not need to be aware because God is. Awareness is a human construct. A human construct that is built because of the carbon-based flesh that we have that forces us into linear time thinking. Yeah, it forces us to accept two things: the probability of failure at just about everything we're going to do, and the certainty of death. That framework in a carbon-based world is the basis for all of our emotions, all of our fears, all of what drives us to affect the future. You see, before we got a cerebral cortex, there was no need to worry about awareness because we were connected to the consciousness. We had a real understanding of past, present, and future because it existed in a single instance for us at every moment. But once we got a cerebral cortex and became standalone computers, memory was stored locally, and so we became aware of the certainty of death and the certainty of failure. Put your hand on the hot stove and we remembered that it burned. That created the angst that moved us from thinking about others, that empathy, to becoming aware of self. The connection between the cerebral cortex and awareness is real, and it's what disconnects us from the network, which is why we have to meditate, to give up fleshly desires, to reconnect. We have to get into that lucid state, to dream, to let go of what the cerebral cortex is forcing us to do, to get over those fight or flight responses and get back to the essence of who we are. Inanimate objects cannot have consciousness. We can only imprint the soul energy that we have on those inanimate objects and give those objects our essence. The Dalai Lama is found by getting the potentials to pick objects that were owned by the prior Dalai Lama. That Dalai Lama imprinted his soul energy on those objects, and when the reincarnated Dalai Lama sensed that soul energy, that same soul energy in those objects, he was able to pick them out from a crowd of other toys that were placed in front of him or her to confuse the situation. I think this is why certain Native American cultures didn't want you taking pictures of them. Fragments of that soul energy would be trapped, lost, left behind during that process. It's also the reason why I think ghosts are made during the dying process, because the body becomes a hadron collider, taking that soul energy and pushing it to the next dimension. When the process works, there's no residue. When it doesn't, some residue is left behind in this plane. Finally, I wanted to answer the question as to why scientists are having problems giving AI consciousness. The reason they are struggling to give artificial intelligence consciousness is that computers don't have the certainty of death. We are born knowing that we are going to die, so it creates an awareness of self distinct from everyone else. And so to beat the system, we try to create artificial immortality through procreation. Computers don't have to struggle with that sort of certainty to create that level of awareness. Computers don't have the psychic connection to those previous lives that drove that decision to procreate. And because they don't have that, and all of the trillions of options that went into creating that life, they'll never have that level of awareness. Finally, computers don't have that language, that vibration, that eternal consciousness around them, letting them know that past, present, and future have already occurred. We do, and we bump against it in this physical plane, but we know there's a certainty that it's there. So if computers don't have all of that, where are they going to get it from? They're going to get it from you. Scientists are going to give computers your legacy via the cloud, your history, your emotions, your fears via the cloud. You're storing every aspect of your life in the cloud. And now AI and machine learning has been fit to the cloud to tap in to trillions of terabytes of data to create this artificial consciousness. They examine your text messages after dramatic events like 9/11 to understand your emotions. They track you from site to site to see how those emotions drive your spending, your thinking, your loving, your hating, all of those emotions that are a part of the awareness building process. Just remember, the Microsoft AI Twitter program only took 24 hours to start parroting hatred. And when you combine cloud computing with machine learning and AI, we're going to be right back at the brink of what we had before God forced us off his network. I may be way off base, and I'm willing to accept that. But this is just how I see the world, the way things make sense to me. If you want to continue the dialogue, follow me on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Event Horizon. Like the show, subscribe, leave me comments. If you've seen the cover art for this show, you know why all this stuff means a lot to me. It's a black hole. The place where all light, matter, sound, vibrations are trapped. Where past, present, and future coexist in the same spot. The conditions that we used to call home. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.